Please, I'm begging you. Untie it." The words slipped out like a prayer already half lost to the wind, but they struck Thomas Calder harder than any bullet ever could, freezing him in place with his hand still hovering inches from the coarse rope. His breath caught somewhere between duty and mercy, between everything he had been taught, and everything his heart was screaming at him to do. And if this moment already has you holding your breath, like this video and subscribe to the channel right now, because stories like this are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to be felt. The sun hung low over the Arizona plains, bleeding orange and red across the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dry earth. And Thomas had ridden this land his entire life, every fence post and dust trail as familiar to him as his own hands. Yet nothing had prepared him for the sight before him: an Apache girl, no more than 16, kneeling in the dirt beneath the twisted mesquite trees, wrists bound so tightly the rope had cut into her skin, her shoulders slumped not in surrender but exhaustion, as if she had already fought every battle she could, and had nothing left but hope. The land around them was silent, unnaturally so, as though it too was watching, waiting to see which version of Thomas Calder would step forward, the rancher molded by generations of fear, or the man standing face to face with a suffering child. Thomas had grown up on stories, the kind whispered by firelight and spoken louder when anger or whiskey loosened tongues, stories of Apache raids, of stolen cattle, of men killed in the night and women left widowed, stories that taught him one unbreakable rule: never interfere, never show weakness, and never, under any circumstance, help an Apache, because mercy, according to his father, was just another word for foolishness. Those stories had shaped his spine, straightened his back, hardened his hands, and kept him alive in a world where land was claimed with blood long before it was marked on maps. Yet standing there now, dust swirling around his boots, Thomas felt those old lessons wobble under the weight of reality, because the girl before him did not look like an enemy. She looked like someone's daughter, someone who had run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, someone who had been caught and punished not for violence but for defiance. He noticed the dried blood at her temple, the tremor in her shoulders as she tried to stay upright, and when she lifted her head to look at him, her eyes were dark and steady, not pleading in weakness, but asking a question that demanded an answer: would he see her as human or as history? His horse shifted beneath him, sensing his unease, and Thomas dismounted slowly, the leather creaking loudly in the silence, every step toward her feeling like he was crossing an invisible line drawn decades before he was born. He told himself to turn back, to leave her as he had found her, to ride home and convince himself it wasn't his problem. But his feet kept moving, guided by something deeper than reason, something he had buried for years beneath duty and routine. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd thought. The rope was old and rough, tied by someone who hadn't cared whether she lived or died, and her hands were swollen, fingers stiff from lack of circulation. She flinched when he knelt, not in fear of him, but in expectation of pain, as if the world had already taught her what to expect from men standing over her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and rough, unused to gentleness, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. But then she swallowed and whispered, "Ayana," like the name itself was a piece of home she was clinging to. As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust, Ayana told him in broken breaths what had happened. How men had come to her village promising work and safety, how girls were taken to ranches and mines under the excuse of opportunity, how she had run when she realized escape was the only choice left to her, and how she had been caught just beyond Thomas's fence line, tied there not because she had done something wrong, but because they wanted others to see what happened to Apache girls who refused to obey. Each word hit Thomas like a hammer, cracking open memories he had tried to forget, especially the image of his little sister years ago, pale and burning with fever, begging him for water when he was too young and powerless to save her. And suddenly the past and present collided, and the fear he had always associated with Apache blood was replaced by something far more dangerous to his old beliefs: empathy. His hand shook as he reached for the knife at his belt, and he hesitated, not because he didn't want to cut the rope, but because he knew exactly what that act would mean. Once he did this, there would be no pretending, no neutrality, no hiding behind tradition. Cutting that rope would place him firmly on one side of history, and history was not kind to those who defied it alone. He thought of his father's grave on the hill, of the ranch hands who depended on him, of the neighbors who already watched him closely, and for a split second fear surged back strong enough to almost stop him. Then Ayanna spoke again, softer this time, her voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion. "Please," she said, and that single word was enough to shatter what remained of his hesitation. The knife slid through the rope with a sharp, final sound, the fibers snapping like gunfire in the still air, and Ayanna collapsed forward with a gasp as blood rushed painfully back into her hands. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground, his arms moving on instinct. And for a moment they stayed like that, the rancher and the Apache girl bound not by rope but by the irreversible act that had just taken place. Tears streamed down her face, silent and uncontrollable, and Thomas felt his own throat tighten, emotions he didn't have words for pressing against his chest. He helped her stand, steadying her as she swayed, and lifted her onto his horse, aware with crystal clarity that someone would notice she was gone, that questions would be asked, and that answers would come with consequences. As they rode away from the fence line and into the deepening dusk, the sky darkened to purple and blue, stars beginning to prick through the fading light, and Thomas realized that the land felt different now, not hostile, not watchful, but alive with possibility and danger in equal measure. He didn't know where this choice would lead, only that there was no road back to who he had been that morning, and as Ayanna leaned forward slightly, trusting him without question, Thomas Calder understood that tradition, once broken, could never bind him the same way again. Night settled over the ranch like a living thing, thick and watchful, wrapping the land in shadows that stretched and shifted with every flicker of starlight, and Thomas Calder had never been more aware of how sound traveled in the dark. The soft crunch of hooves on dry soil, the distant call of an owl, the low creak of the saddle as Ayanna leaned forward slightly, trusting him in a way that felt heavier than any accusation. He rode past the main house and deeper toward the creek, choosing the long way instinctively, avoiding lantern light and open ground, knowing that once dawn came questions would follow, and questions, in a place built on unspoken rules, were often more dangerous than answers. The old storage cabin sat beyond a line of cottonwoods, half swallowed by time and neglect, a place his father had once said was good for nothing except keeping ghosts company, and Thomas had never imagined it would become a refuge. Yet as he helped Ayanna down from the horse and guided her inside, it felt like the only place where the world might pause long enough to let her breathe. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, but it was dry, and that alone felt like a gift. Thomas laid out a blanket, handed her water, and watched as she drank carefully, as if afraid it might be taken away if she moved too fast. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were clearer, steadier, and he saw something else there now. Caution mixed with gratitude, the kind born from knowing kindness often came with a price. He told her she could rest, that no one would come for her tonight, though even as he said it he knew it wasn't entirely true, because the men who tied her would not simply shrug and move on, and word of her disappearance would spread like wildfire through the tight, knit ranching community by morning. As he left her to sleep and stepped back into the night, Thomas felt the weight of his choice settle fully onto his shoulders, heavy and inescapable. Yet beneath that weight was something unexpected, a strange, fragile sense of peace. The following days unfolded slowly, each hour stretched thin by anticipation. Thomas brought food and clean water, bandages for her wrists, and a small mirror he'd found tucked away in a drawer, watching quietly as Ayanna began to reclaim herself piece by piece. She spoke more as her strength returned, telling him of her people, of songs sung to children at dusk, of stories meant to teach courage rather than fear, and each word chipped away at the hardened image Thomas had carried of Apache life, replacing myth with humanity. He listened more than he spoke, realizing how little he truly knew, and in those quiet moments, sitting on an overturned crate while she warmed her hands around a tin cup. He began to understand how silence had allowed injustice to thrive, how his refusal to choose had always been a choice after all. It didn't take long for the ranch hands to notice his absences. They followed tracks to the creek one afternoon, anger flaring when Thomas refused to explain himself, and the confrontation that followed was sharp and immediate. Voices rose, accusations flew, betrayal, recklessness, danger, and Thomas felt the familiar urge to back down, to smooth things over, to return to the role everyone expected him to play. But then he remembered Ayana's voice breaking as she begged him to untie the rope, and something inside him held firm. He told them the truth, plainly and without apology, that a girl had been bound on his land, that he had freed her, and that if protecting a child made him a traitor, then so be it. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, and he knew in that moment that lines had been drawn that could not be erased. News traveled fast, faster than Thomas could control, and by the time he realized how far the story had spread, it was too late to contain. Some neighbors avoided him, others watched with open hostility, and a few, very few, offered quiet nods of approval they were too afraid to voice aloud. Tension built like a storm on the horizon, and Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before the men responsible for tying Ayana would come looking for answers, or worse, revenge. He prepared himself for that possibility, checking his rifle at night, walking the fence lines with a sharper eye, yet every time fear threatened to take hold, he returned to the cabin and found Ayana standing a little taller, her hands steadier, her spirit unbroken, and it reminded him why he had chosen this path. The turning point came unexpectedly, carried on the backs of horses approaching from the east, their silhouettes cutting through the afternoon haze. Apache elders arrived not with weapons raised, but with deliberate calm, their presence commanding silence without force. Thomas met them outside the cabin, heart pounding, aware that this meeting carried the weight of generations. Words were exchanged carefully at first, history hovering between them like an unspoken warning, until Ayana stepped forward, no longer hidden, no longer bound. She spoke of what had been done to her, but more importantly, she spoke of what had not, of a man who had chosen to listen, to act, to see her as human rather than history's enemy. Her voice did not accuse, it testified, and as she spoke, something remarkable happened. Faces softened, shoulders eased. The past did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. What followed was not a miracle, but it was a beginning. Agreements were discussed, boundaries acknowledged, and apologies, awkward, imperfect, but sincere, were offered where none had existed before. Thomas stood witness to it all, humbled by the realization that one act of compassion had opened a door he never knew existed. He understood then that reconciliation was not about forgetting the past, but about refusing to let it dictate every future choice. When the elders finally prepared to leave, Ayana turned to him, gratitude shining in her eyes, and thanked him not as a savior, but as a man who had done what was right when it mattered most. The aftermath was not easy. Thomas lost business, lost friends, and gained a reputation that followed him wherever he went, but he also gained something far more valuable, a sense of integrity that no amount of approval could replace. He continued to run his ranch, continued to face criticism and skepticism, yet over time subtle changes took root. Conversations shifted, children asked different questions. The story of the rancher who broke tradition spread, told and retold, reshaped by each voice until it became something larger than a single act, a reminder that courage was not always loud or violent, but often quiet, steady, and deeply human. Years later, long after the dust of that summer had settled, Thomas would stand at the edge of his land and watch the sun dip below the horizon. Remembering the moment everything changed. The plea that stopped him in his tracks, the rope that fell away, the fear he chose to face instead of obey. He understood now that tradition could guide, but it should never blind, and that the strongest legacy a person could leave was not land or wealth, but the proof that kindness, once given, could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. And if this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you that one choice can challenge generations, that empathy can break chains where force never could, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps stories like this alive, and you never know whose heart might change because you chose to listen.